It is 7 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Are there any questions from last class? I don't know if this class was recorded, if there's uh, one or two people here who weren't here uh, previously. This class is on our YouTube channel. You can find our YouTube channel from our homepage, just at the top of tnlsf.org. The very top, the left-hand side, talks about our YouTube channel, and you can go directly there from the homepage. So if you miss a class, you can find it. We put almost everything up there unless there's some sort of technical problem and something accidentally didn't get recorded. Yes, Christina.
Sorry, it took me a while to get the button. I just wanted to ask, I was looking through my notes, and when you were talking about the sacred sites in Buddhism,
Mhm.
Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, there was one more, wasn't there?
Um,
Is it-
so Sarnath can also, Varanasi is also quite close to Sarnath. So
Okay.
sometimes it can be called Sarnath or Varanasi. But it's basically the same. I mean, of course, if we're talking about like Tibetan Buddhism historically, there are many others. There are places in India, places in Tibet where other, there's because, but they were generally referred to like other like places where Milarepa, meditated, or Lama Tsongkhapa established a monastery. You're talking generally about like other sites that are holy, or sites of pilgrimage for other reasons. So there are many pilgrimage sites, but
Thank you.
any other questions? Okay, so this is class 2. We've got, after tonight, there's 3 more classes, the remaining Fridays in March. But toward the end of last class, we looked at the 4 noble truths, the 4 things that are known to be true by the Arya beings, the noble beings, those who have developed their mind to a point, to a level where they see the nature of reality directly. And that's a concept that will not become clear right away, but will become a bit more clear, at least by the end of the class. But those noble beings, Arya beings, who have cultivated their mind in that way, look at the world and see the world differently than we see it. We being, beings who haven't cultivated their mind to that degree, whose mind is still very strongly under the influence of afflicted states of mind, which is, an English translation of the word klesha, affliction or delusion, um, both kind of getting at the concept that the mind is not seeing things clearly. The mind is seeing things through um, obscuration, through layers of um, problematic states of mind that are in between the mind and reality, whereas these Arya beings have kind of purified those obscurations, and their mind is more in line, more directly in line with the actual nature of reality. So the Arya beings see the world as being true in 4 ways, characterized by 4 truths, and we looked at that. Um, So we talked about how those 4 noble truths are the blueprint for everything that the Buddha taught, that the Buddha taught how to understand suffering and how to overcome suffering. And we saw how that is essentially almost entirely occurring in the mind. Of course, it plays out in the body, it plays out We are embodied beings, so the mind is mediated through the body and through sensory experiences. But the process of creating the what we will come to see as karmic seeds, karmic propensities, is a mental process. And then that energy is flowing through a physical system as well. But really, what Buddhism is concerned with is the mind, and training the mind and cultivating the mind. So we're going to zoom out a little bit now and look at the Buddhist model of the mind. So, mind in Tibetan Buddhism is has a definition which is here on the screen, the mind, and we can use mind and consciousness interchangeably. Those two words in Buddhism can be used indistinguishably or interchangeably because it refers to the sum total of mental process. It doesn't, sometimes in English, we might say conscious and unconscious. Um, and that isn't a distinction that is made in Buddhism. Um, the mind is functioning at all times. The mind can't cease to function. So we might have a waking mind, and then we might have an unconscious, sleeping, dreaming, mind. The mind has different levels of awareness, but the mind doesn't come into being and then cease and then come into being and then cease. The mind is always operating on some level of awareness. So we don't talk about conscious and unconscious as being two separate things. The mind is that which can be experiencing waking conscious reality, and the mind is that which can be experiencing a dream state or a deep sleep or a coma state or something of that nature. The mind itself is, as we see here, the definition is that which is clear and knowing, or that which is possessed of clarity and awareness. So the mind then is distinct from the body, it's distinct from the brain. It is intimately connected with the brain, intimately connected with the body, but it is its own continuum. And it is an energy, therefore, that we can say has two qualities, again, clarity and awareness. But clarity, in this sense, is getting at its nature as being a formless energy, an energy that doesn't have a distinct shape or color or size or smell or taste or touch. It's getting at its intangible energetic quality rather than a different English way of understanding the word clear, which could mean like completely accurate or completely pure. There is a level of mind that we can talk about as being free from, as being what they would call primordially pure, but then that's a level of mind that we're not really in touch with. Most of the levels of mind that we interact with are arising together with afflicted states, delusory states. And that's still mind, that's not something other than mind. So it doesn't it doesn't require that the mind be operating from a state of purity, because generally for us, for ordinary beings, the mind is always arising together with an afflicted state, unfortunately. And then also knowing also doesn't require that that the process of knowing is happening in a completely um, undisturbed or completely accurate way. It only means that when the mind is directed toward an object, then there is an internal representation of that object that arises within the mind. It can certainly be distorted in some way. It can certainly be a apprehension, or some aspect of that knowing might not be fully accurate, but there is still an internal representation that is generated when the mind is directed toward an object. Um, so then we talk about types of mind. And um, so there are here, we list the five bodily sense consciousnesses. So again, I mentioned that mind and consciousness can be used interchangeably. So Buddhism talks about six types of mind, or six types of consciousness. We have the five bodily sense consciousnesses, which are ways in which we do know, ways in which we develop some understanding of objects, is through our ability to see them, to touch them, to taste them, to hear them, or to smell them. Um, One or more of those consciousnesses do in fact help us, as I mentioned, as embodied beings, to develop understanding, to know, to develop awareness of objects of awareness. Um, so many objects of awareness that we come across can be known in one or more of those ways. And that does help us to develop some understanding of what it is that we're in relationship with, that the mind is creating an internal representation of. And then we have the mental sense consciousness, which is the sixth type of consciousness. And this is, generally almost always operating in tandem with one or more of the five bodily sense consciousnesses. It can operate in isolation from any of the bodily sense consciousnesses. For example, when we remember something that, happened before, or we plan for something that we expect to happen, or we would like to happen, or we just have a daydream. We just think, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I was at the beach? And we kind of generate um, a mental environment of being somewhere else or doing something else. So daydreaming, remembering, planning, these are all things that can just be occurring simply within the mental sense consciousness. But it also an important distinction, and one of the primary reasons that it's important to understand the Buddhist model of the mind is because of what I was alluding to just earlier, that for us as ordinary sentient beings who are subject to afflicted states, those afflicted states are very, kind of omnipresent in the mind. And so as we're going about engaging in cognitions, in moments of awareness, in knowing objects, um, we are not doing it in a completely accurate, completely clear way. Maybe clear again isn't the best, but in a way that is not negatively impacted by these afflicted states. And so the relationship between the physical senses and the mental sense consciousness is a really important relationship to understand deeply, because, as I mentioned, these two types of consciousness often arise together. And their relationship is one in which the, I consciousness, for example, is cognizing some external person or painting or food or, some object, a lamp or an animal, any kind of physical object in the world. It's appearing to the eye sense consciousness. And then the mental sense consciousness is making a judgment about that sensory data. It's placing it in the camp or the category of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. Um, so we might look at a particular painting and, we might really like a certain type of art, and we might dislike a different type of art. And when we see something that is in that, European masters that we, really have a lot of admiration for, it seems really soothing, really pleasing to the mind. When we see like a Jackson Pollock or something, and it seems discordant and busy, and then we have visceral kinds of reactions to both of those experiences. Same thing with music, same thing with food, same thing with other people. We think, oh, that's an attractive person, that's an unattractive person. I would like to get to know the attractive person, not so interested in getting to know the unattractive person. I would like to have more of this kind of food. I would like to have less of this other kind of food. So none of those judgments, none of those categories are occurring in the physical sense consciousnesses. They're judgments that are occurring in the mental sense consciousness in dependence upon the data are being entered into the mind or appearing to the mind through one or more of the mental sense consciousnesses. But we're really bad at, just as ordinary people, we're really bad at distinguishing how that's occurring. We, because those two things are arising essentially almost simultaneously, we, in an unconscious, not sort of unconscious in the Freudian sense, kind of in an unanalytical way, we ascribe the mental sense judgment or, judgment to the object itself. And we think that our judgment about it as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral is something that we are passively noticing that is part of the object itself. And it isn't really a judgment that is being put upon sensory data appearing to the mind. So that's a really critical part of why Buddhism is encouraging us to understand how cognition arises. Because, as we'll see, Buddhism is very interested in replacing faulty cognition or mistaken cognition with clear, accurate, real, true cognition, seeing things more and more clearly. And we can't really do that unless we understand how this process is actually occurring in the mind. There's a whole, kind of category of Buddhist thinking, Buddhist philosophy called Lorig, which is all about how to understand this model of the mind. There's a module in Discovering Buddhism about the mind. There's, if you go on to study what's called the basic program, which Discovering Buddhism is a 2-year program that FPMT offers. The basic program is a 5-year program that comes generally after that also FPMT offers. There's 2 other like 6-month modules in the basic program, so a whole year. So like, basically a year and a half or, a year and 3 months or 2 months of, and different centers do it differently in terms of exactly how much detail. But just to say, it's a huge subject that can be studied in great detail, and Buddhism really encourages that level, ultimately that level of specificity so that we can really deeply understand. So I'll talk just a little bit more and then I'll pause for questions. Okay, so then to just unpack what has been said, or to wrap up what's been said about this Buddhist model of the mind, we can say then a mental event requires one of the six consciousnesses, not necessarily all of them. As I said, sometimes, there's a physical sense consciousness that's operating in tandem with a mental sense consciousness, or it could just be a mental sense consciousness. Um, but at least one of the six consciousnesses. And then you need an object of awareness. The mind has to be focused on a sight, a sound, a taste, a touch, a feeling, or just a mental, a thought like, anger or love, or again, a memory or planning for the future. There has to be something that the mind is directed towards. So you need an object that the mind is actively knowing. And then you need what's called a prior moment in the continuity of mind. So, if our eyes are closed, for example, there are no objects of the eye sense consciousness that can be appearing to the mind. We have to open our eyes, and then, the light takes a couple of milliseconds or whatever to hit the retinas. And, so you need that prior moment in the continuity of that mind in order for the objects to arise. And Buddhism would say that in general, in terms of the mental sense consciousness, that continuity of mind is both beginningless and endless. So presently, we are embodied, our consciousness is embodied in a human form. And the human form, we're kind of, in a way, we are talking about this now in the way in which humans are experiencing the world. Not all, not all animals, for example, have all of those senses. There are some animals that have no sight. And of course, it's true also that not all humans have sight, not all humans have hearing. But in general, humans have, the five sense faculties, but certainly not all humans have all five fully complete. And that can change over a lifetime. You can lose one of the senses, or more, what have you. Um, but it's also true that there are some animals, for example, and Buddhism would talk about beings in completely other realms of existence. They may not have um, any of those physical senses, or not all of those physical senses. But the mental sense consciousness is both beginningless and endless. So that Buddhism would describe that as the nature of mind itself, is a beginningless and endless continuity of these mental events. So we can talk about the fact that cognition can occur is empowered by the fact that the mental sense consciousness is beginningless and endless. And within that, in terms of our human existence, which is what we're currently experiencing, we do have these five other bodily sense consciousnesses that are also ways in which we are aware, ways in which we are knowing objects. Um, and with respect to each of those, you do have to have their own prior moment. So, you do have to have the eyes open, the ability for the ears. If the ears are completely blocked, then there's no prior moment of that continuity. You've kind of momentarily blocked that particular continuity. But the mental sense consciousness is actually a continuity that cannot be blocked. that is beginningless and endless, and is the foundation or the basis for any of the other bodily sense consciousnesses to be operative. So it's occurring again, even in a coma, even in the deepest sleep, even when we are nearing death, the mental sense consciousness is still on some level present, is in some level operating. And that is the foundation for the capacity, at least, to hear, to taste, to touch, etc. Okay, so I will pause. Any thoughts or questions? Nope. Okay. So that is just a little overview of the Buddhist model of the mind. And again, an incredibly an important topic if we are eventually going to be successful in replacing mistaken cognition with accurate cognition, is to become just like if we want to, when we talked about the Four Noble Truths, we said, well, the reason that the Buddha talked about the truth, true suffering in such detail is because if we have a cursory understanding of the truth of suffering, then we will think it appropriate to apply very surface level antidotes to the truth of to true suffering. And in the same way, if we think that, that the mind works in a very simplistic way, then we won't really investigate how it is that we are generating these mistaken cognitions, and we won't really be able to go deep enough to apply the antidotes that will get rid of or that will replace um, mistaken cognition with accurate cognition. So we're going to switch gears now again and go in a little bit different direction and talk about what are called the four seals, or here what it means to be a Buddhist. What it means to be a Buddhist in this context. This section is going to have two subsections. The first subsection are the four seals. The second subsection is the five lay vows. And these two subsections, you could say, present what it means to be a Buddhist. A Buddhist is someone, you could say, who has adopted a philosophy that is coherent with the four seals, and is also someone who has adopted a lifestyle that is coherent or cohesive with the five lay precepts. So, taken together, you could say that's what a Buddhist practitioner is. Okay. And so, seal here is kind of like a royal seal, like this, like the wax seal on an envelope, which the king or queen, or they press their signet ring into the wax seal in order to verify that the contents of that letter validly came from that person, that that it's a genuine communication from the king or queen. You can infer that by the presence of the wax seal. So if a philosophy is in line with these four concepts that we will go into, then you can say that it's validly a Buddhist teaching. It is, sealed with these four things. And if you are presented with a philosophy that is at odds with any of these four seals, then it's not a valid Buddhist teaching, which, is fine. It could just be a teaching from a different religious tradition or some kind of incompatible, philosophical view, which, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just to say this is what is something that we can say is validly Buddhist, or it's non-Buddhist. And non-Buddhist is fine, but it's just to show you how to distinguish between the two. Okay. So the first seal is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. All compounded phenomena are impermanent. So we have to define what is a compounded phenomena and what does impermanent mean in order to know what this sentence means. So a compounded phenomena is anything that exists as a product, meaning that it is composed of other things. And so essentially anything that is in our world, anything that you can interact with, is a compounded phenomena. So our bodies are compounded phenomena. All of the things that we can pick up and taste and touch and manipulate, and cats and dogs and plants and grass and everything is essentially everything that has physicality is a compounded phenomena, um, because it has atoms, it has different elements. It has, you can talk about it having a front and a back and a top and a bottom and an inside and an outside. It's composed of a variety of things. There's some iron, there's some oxygen, there's some carbon, all kinds of different composite aspects to it. That's true of just about anything that is present in our world that we can have any kind of interaction with. And anything that is like that is impermanent, which means that it changes moment by moment by moment by moment. That whenever you are observing through taste, through touch, through sight, through sound, you know, through any of the senses, if you are observing anything that does exist as a product, is composed of other things, then the Buddhist way of understanding that phenomena is that that phenomena is a continuum, is a continuity, and is changing moment by moment by moment. So when we look in our room and we look at a water bottle, or we look at a picture, or we look at a table or a chair, in our minds that table, that chair that we saw, that was in our room yesterday, it was in our room the day before, it's going to be in our room tomorrow, we think that that table, that chair, that picture is the same table, chair, picture that we're looking at presently than it was when we saw it this morning, when we woke up, than when we saw it yesterday. And it's tomorrow when we wake up again and it's still there. We think it's the same table, chair, picture. Um, but the Buddhist understanding is that that is a compounded phenomena. It exists in dependence upon different parts. And so it itself is a continuity, a continuum, and it's undergoing momentary change. And so there's two kinds of impermanence. There's subtle impermanence, and then there's gross or coarse impermanence. Um, and we can, if we puzzle it out, if we think about it, we can understand that over longer periods of time, that that table, that chair will change in visible ways, um, even if nothing really happens to it, just by its exposure to moisture, to changes in temperature, to the oxygen. Um, it may take very long periods of time for, depending on the forces that are acting on it. But we can understand intellectually that atoms, molecules, electrons of that phenomena in each millisecond are, those bonds are breaking, those chemical bonds, those electromagnetic, bonds, and they're breaking down. And so it may take a long time, or in some cases, a short time. If you knock a glass off of your table, that glass very rapidly will go from a glass to a bunch of shards of glass. Um, and the reason that that can happen, the reason that any of that visible change happens, is because of the nature of that phenomena being impermanent, meaning that moment by moment by moment, that phenomena is undergoing change. It's never the same in any two moments. And that, but generally speaking, that subtle impermanence, which is occurring nanosecond by nanosecond, isn't visible to any of our consciousnesses, any of our, neither any of our physical senses nor the mental sense consciousness. Over longer periods of time, there will be a physical change that we will observe in the object. It will stop working as well as it did. It will become scratched. It will become dirty. It will change in visible ways. Um, and eventually, even if nothing happens, even if no one breaks it, no one touches it, eventually it will become a pile of dust. That's what physics would tell us, that any of these objects, eventually they will, under their own power, kind of disintegrate. And that's subtle impermanence giving rise to coarse or gross impermanence. And so what the Buddha is saying is that anything that we interact with is of that nature, that it itself is by its own nature changing moment by moment by moment, and oftentimes is moving toward a state where we wouldn't call it what we call it now. Because what we call it now is dependent upon the function that it performs. If we have a webcam, we call it a webcam because when we plug it in, it does what we think it's supposed to do. It will record an image. Once it stops being able to do that, it's a broken webcam. It's garbage. It's trash. It's not, a webcam. If we have speakers and they don't produce sound, they're not speakers. They're trash. It's something that we throw away. And that's kind of the direction that things, for the most part, that's the direction that things are kind of moving in. They're moving in the direction of no longer performing the function that is the reason that they have the label that they have. So they're kind of moving toward dysregulation. They're moving toward, and again, this is also supported by physics. This is sort of the idea of entropy, right? Things are moving away from being organized, away from being, working as you would expect, to being disorganized, to moving in a state of disrepair. Um, so, but in general, but the mind is also, for example, another phenomena that is also changing moment by moment by moment, but isn't moving toward that state of like not being mind at some point in the future. So it doesn't require, this idea of impermanence is complicated. It doesn't require decay. It doesn't, in many cases with physical things, decay, or if it's animate, then we could even say death is a side effect of impermanence. But the mind is another phenomena that is undergoing momentary change, but the mind will never become non-mind, will never become something other than mind. The mind will not cease, but the body will cease. The body will, we will cease to exist in this lifetime when the body, due to its impermanence, can no longer be a host to this consciousness. We call that death, when the body changes in such a way that it can't host consciousness, body and mind separate, and that is what we would refer to as the death of ourselves or the death of any other animate being. Um, so, but the word impermanent itself only means that which changes moment by moment by moment. So things that are impermanent can either be impermanent and temporary or impermanent but eternal. So in English, impermanent usually is almost always used to mean changing, some type of temporariness. In Buddhism, it's not the case, because the mind, for example, is impermanent but eternal. But TVs and laptops and tables, those are impermanent and temporary. At some point, they will cease to perform their function, and we will not refer to them as tables and TVs when that happens. But we can't always infer temporariness from impermanence. Any questions about the first seal? Nope. Okay, so then the second seal is all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. And contaminated thing is kind of an intense phrase, but it has a technical definition. So again, here, like before, we need to define contaminated thing and unsatisfactory in order to know what is meant by the second seal. And a contaminated thing is anything which has past karma and delusion as its origin. So again, for us as ordinary sentient beings who exist on planet Earth, um, essentially everything that we interact with is a contaminated thing, um, because our mind is ordinary, um, and because our mind is ordinary, our mind is under the influence of karma and delusion or affliction. And so everything that our ordinary minds give rise to also are the product of past karma and delusion, or afflicted states of mind. So it really just means that which is ordinary, that which is not the result, which isn't enlightened mind or a product of enlightened mind. That's really what a contaminated thing is, that which is ordinary mind or the product of ordinary mind is a contaminated thing. That which is enlightened mind or the product of enlightened mind is not a contaminated thing. Um, and and again, contaminated is sort of a harsh word, I think, but it basically that relates to this idea of unsatisfactory. It's contaminated because when we interact with it, when we try to bring it into our experience, it isn't able to give rise to real, genuine, permanent, lasting happiness. Our body is, you could say, in the nature of dissatisfactoriness, because we've got these aches, we've got these pains, we get headaches, we get, the body can get cancer, the body can get, all kinds of disease. Is That's the nature of the body, is to experience those kinds of things. The nature of ordinary mind is to be subject to hatred, to maliciousness, to covetousness, to um, a hoarding mentality, to all of these painful states. And therefore, all of the things that we come up with in the world, all of the things that are a product of the world, even the natural world, the plants, the animals, and so on, there's, when you kind of look at Buddhist cosmology, they would say that the environment of a group, of a large group of like minds, so all, it gets a little complicated, but humans are is a realm or a type of experience that mind can have. It's a slice of experience that is open to what we are. There are slices of experience that are not open to what we are. And for example, the animal realm is a different, we Buddhism would assert that we coexist on the earth with animals. Buddhism doesn't present humans as animals, although that is the kind of Western scientific understanding, because we're not plants, we're not fungus, we're not, you know, inanimate. So we're classed that way from that perspective. But the subjective experiences that we are capable of having are quite distinct from the kinds of experience that cats and dogs and fish and iguana and whales and that they are capable of having. So Buddhism distinguishes between those two slices of experience, those two kind of ranges of experience. Um, and so even those other kinds of ordinary um, sentient beings like animals, they are also part of this unenlightened kind of realm that we share the earth with. Um, so, yeah, so neither humans nor animals are able to interact with um, objects of awareness that are able to give rise to genuine, permanent, true, lasting happiness. Enlightened mind is, of course, different. That's the whole kind of point of Buddhism, is to give rise to create the inner causes and conditions to transform ordinary mind into enlightened mind. That's the positive good news that the Buddha, has, is that yes, our mind at present is ordinary mind. And yes, ordinary mind is subject to afflicted states, and misknowing, misapprehension. But we have the seeds in our mind of wisdom, of clear understanding, and we can grow those seeds, and we can nourish and grow that into enlightened mind with time, with energy, with effort, with discipline. Um, and then our mind is not a contaminated thing, and the products of our mind are not contaminated things. And the mind is experiencing real, genuine, lasting, permanent happiness. Um, that's just not our present experience. Any thoughts or questions about the second seal? Yes.
I actually had a question about the first one because I didn't
Mhm,
write
sure.
it down. Um, Compounded phenomena, that just means like all things on the planet, right?
It means anything that if you observe it, if you can say that what you are observing has parts, is composed of other things, then it's a compounded phenomena. So there's very few things that are not compounded phenomena. The main example that they give is of something that's not a compounded phenomena is the philosophical concept of space. Um, so space in this context is the mere lack of obstructive contact. So it's distinguished from intermediate space. Intermediate space would be like the distance between two objects. That's intermediate space, and it is composed of other things. It's composed of, different gases and things. The philosophical idea of that which lacks obstructive contact is not a compounded thing. Um, but that's really kind of the only example that they give that I'm aware of something
So
that's
I can
not a
say all
compound.
things on the planet except for space.
Yeah, of the
So I
of
can
the
understand it the best.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just need to write that down. So
Any other thoughts or questions, concerns, objections? So then the third seal is all phenomena are selfless. And this is something that is getting at kind of something that we're going to have to come back to kind of later. This idea, because it takes quite a while to unpack this idea of all phenomena are selfless. This is getting at kind of the core teaching of Buddhism. But so in a way, we kind of have to put a pin in it and come back and flesh it out, mostly in the last class, the fifth class. But what we can say is that going back to what we've been talking about, this idea that we know things, that we cognize things through the five senses and also the mental sense consciousness. And again, we talked about how we conflate um, those two things. We conflate the data that's arriving to the mind through the five senses with the judgments that we make about that data. For an ordinary person, those two things seem like the same thing. And we talked about how that conflating gives rise to the view, the idea that the judgments that we make about what we are observing is something that is present in what we are observing. And that's not, essentially, the Buddha says that's not true. That when we observe, when we cognize, and when we think that we're doing that passively, that we're noticing, oh, this painting is beautiful, or this piece of music is, discordant, is offensive, is unattractive to the mind, or this person is attractive, or this person is unattractive, or this food is delicious, or this food is abhorrent. Um, all of these judgments, to our mind, we put that judgment in the object that's being cognized, being observed. And the Buddha says, no, we can't validly put that judgment in the object. We have to recognize that that judgment is occurring in the mental sense consciousness. So the mental sense consciousness is very much actively giving rise to our subjective experience of what we are observing, what we are being aware of. And so this idea of self and selfless has very much to do with this idea that cognition or perception is either passive or active. We think it's passive. We think we're noticing what's really there. The Buddha says that we're actively creating it. And because we're actively creating it, our subjective understanding is kind of a fabrication, kind of something that's very much occurring just in our mind and isn't so much occurring in the world around us, in that which we think we're observing. That's very much kind of the general idea. And so what we'll come back to that and we'll spend almost all of the last class kind of making that as clear as you can in one class. Okay, so then the fourth seal is nirvana is peace. So with this, we've talked in the previous class, we talked about the two main schools of Buddhism. You've got Theravada and you have Mahayana. And you've got those two stated goals of Buddhist practice. The Theravada tradition is aimed at either, you could say, there's different ways of phrasing it. You could say nirvana. And if you say that, then you could say the Mahayana tradition is aimed at enlightenment, or you could say lower nirvana and a greater nirvana or a higher nirvana. So the idea, though, is that either of those are the true cessations that we talked about in the first class, whether it's individual nirvana or whether it's full enlightenment. Those are both true cessations. They are both states that are beyond suffering. Those are both states of perfect peace. And so this would be, but if a person says that if you are just a good person, then you get to go to heaven, and that's kind of the point. That's a different philosophical view, right? That's a different approach. So what this is getting at is that we have to cultivate either individual enlightenment or lower nirvana, or the stated goal of the Theravada tradition, or we cultivate full enlightenment, which is the stated goal of the Mahayana tradition. And both of those are arrived at only by developing an insight into the nature of reality. So they're not, of course, we will see the role of ethics and so on that Buddhism does emphasize, but ultimately there's a very specific scientific methodology for what gives rise to either individual enlightenment or full enlightenment. And that is the only way to experience true, genuine, lasting peace. It is possible to experience realms of existence that are blissful through other means, but they end. They are not permanent. So this is kind of getting at what is a true cessation and how true cessations are accomplished. And so if a different framework is presented other than that, then you would have to conclude it's not a Buddhist framework. Again, totally fine, but this is just how do I recognize if what I'm being taught is a Buddhist teaching or not a Buddhist teaching? And that's how. Does it comport with, is it compatible with all of these four seals? If it is, then it's a valid teaching of the Buddha. If it's not, then it comes from a different philosophical or religious tradition or system. Okay, are there any questions other than I know I just don't have time to go into self and selflessness to a great degree. But any Christina questions?
Yes, one quick question for the second seal. You talked about all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. Could you just say a little bit more about what unsatisfactory means?
Yeah, so it means that, no matter how much we interact with it, um, no matter how good the food that we can eat is, or no matter how much we can be surrounded by, the best, the things that we most enjoy, um, because they are, you know, they are the products of ordinary mind, they have a very limited capacity to bring about any kind of happiness, to bring about any kind of um, change in our mental state, because ultimately they are still the products of ordinary mind, and the mind itself is ordinary mind, and so it is also interacting with them through that lens. So basically, it's not a moralistic kind of thing. It can sound that way, but it really just means, it's occurring in the ordinary realm of things. And then so it is not enlightened mind, and it is not the product of enlightened mind. And therefore it's comparatively not what you want. It's comparatively not as good as enlightened mind or the product of enlightened mind, because enlightened mind and its products are genuine, true, lasting, perfect happiness. And ordinary things just they can't be. They don't have that capacity.
I had a question.
Yes.
So could you explain a little bit more about the lower nirvana and full enlightenment? Is it just that I was writing something down and I missed what you said, but it was the insight into the nature of.
Reality. I mean, I use that phrase kind of because it doesn't mean anything initially. When you say the insight into the nature of reality, it's kind of a nebulous. It doesn't come with any preconceived ideas about what that might mean. Um, but it is the concept of emptiness, the concept of shunyata. Um, but it's just when you say emptiness, well, then that's an English word that kind of can mean something to people. So then it's like, well, empty of what? What does that mean? So I kind of generally use the phrase the nature of reality because I haven't defined that yet. And so, but so there's no kind of possibility of like coming to that with a mistaken understanding of, well, what does that, what's being talked about there. But yeah, so it's ultimately the goal of of any Buddhist practice, um, which is why like the weekend retreat that Geshe Zopa is doing tomorrow and Sunday is called opening the door, to enlightenment. And he's teaching on, which is what he's been teaching on the last several Sundays. And so, I mean, at some point, you may want to, look at those recordings, which will also be on the YouTube channel. If he's a wonderful teacher. That's the topic that he's discussing, is how to give rise to that insight into the nature of reality, because it's common to all Buddhist traditions. In the Mahayana tradition, it's joined. Well, what we'll see when we get into the fourth and the fifth class is that we'll see that it's joined with a particular aspiration. It's joined with what's called bodhicitta in the Mahayana tradition. But the insight into the nature of reality is really the same in every Buddhist tradition. All Buddhist practitioners have to realize the nature of reality in the same way. They have to arrive at the same insight. Um, and what distinguishes it really is whether or not it's joined with bodhicitta. joining it with bodhicitta, and also, using the particular techniques, the meditative techniques that you find in the Vajrayana tradition, which we talked a little bit about last week. All of that together is able to eliminate the subtle obscurations to omniscience that persist in the practitioner, the mind of a practitioner who's achieved individual liberation. So those subtle obscurations to omniscience don't prohibit or don't prevent a Theravada practitioner from achieving individual enlightenment or lower nirvana, but they block the further development into full enlightenment, which is overcome with all of the kind of inner technology that you find in the Mahayana tradition.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so the second half of what it means to be a Buddhist is not only someone who accepts teachings that are concordant with the Four Seals, but also someone who has adopted the ethical teachings of the Buddha, the five lay precepts. So that's what we will get into. So this gets into, to some degree, gets into when a person goes from just studying Buddhism to someone who is Buddhist. They engage in what's called going for refuge. And it's a little bit different than that, but typically when a person does that, they will abide by the refuge commitments, and also the five lay precepts. Those two things come together. Yeah. So the five lay precepts are the foundation of the Buddha's ethical teachings. So the first precept is do not kill. So to kill, as it says here, to kill means to intentionally take the life of any sentient being. We talked a little bit, I think, in the first class of the definition of sentient being. In Tibetan, it's samchan, or mind possessor. So you have a physical form and you have a consciousness that are combined. And if you, as another kind of sentient being who has personal agency, if you intentionally engage in an act that causes the physical form of that sentient being to be damaged, such that that physical form is no longer capable of hosting consciousness, then that consciousness will separate from that physical form, and we call that a killing. And it's prohibited in Buddhism. It's prohibited by the Buddha for someone who has agreed to be bound by the five precepts because they have decided to become a Buddhist, prohibited to engage in an act of killing. And this doesn't apply only to other humans, as it says here. It does apply to any sentient being, and for us, that means humans and also non-human animals. Yes.
Um, I, so do you interpret this vow meaning that you should become a vegetarian? Do you interpret it like this?
So I'll address that maybe just as I
Because
go
I've been
along. Yeah.
wrestling with this
Mhm.
for about 6 months, and I just would really appreciate some advice about it.
Sure. Yeah. So, um, so the vow itself to not kill, as it says here, there's a level of practicality that's built into the vow. These are also called training precepts. So it's meant to be a way in which, by adopting these precepts, these training precepts, we can move in a more ethical direction, that we can, by coming under this training, we can try to develop our mind to embrace ways of thinking that are beneficial to our spiritual growth and development. Um, so you can see here that there is a level of practicality built into this, in the sense that if we kill a non-human, then we damage the vow. It is not permitted, however, um, only when we take the life of a human being do we destroy the vow. And by that, what's meant is that we are not taking the vow seriously enough to be able to say that we hold the vow in our mental continuum. It's kind of disregarding it to such a high degree that we can't validly say that we're bound by it. And there's two reasons that that the Buddha distinguishes between these two. One is it's really difficult to go your whole life and never kill, because when we say non-human sentient being, that goes all the way down to insects. That goes all the way down to mosquitoes and ants and cockroaches and mice, and what we might call pests in many cases. Um, and it's extremely difficult for a person to go 30, 40, 50, 60 years and never even intentionally, like, seeing it, giving rise to aversion, wanting to end its life, and then engaging in an act that brings about its death. Very difficult to go your whole life never doing that. We're meant to, though, we're meant to attempt that, but we will probably not succeed. However, we need to understand that we don't have to retake the vow every time that we fail with respect to a cockroach, what have you. If we take the life of a human, though, we do have to retake the vow. We can't say that we're holding the vow. Which is, again, and the other reason why that's true is because a human can achieve enlightenment in that physical form in that very lifetime, regardless of what they are like. In that moment, they might seem like they are aggressive or violent or self-centered or what have. In that very lifetime, they can become enlightened. And an animal cannot. A dog cannot. It's in that very lifetime, it's not possible. So it's worse also to kill a human being, because you're depriving them of the potential to achieve enlightenment in that very lifetime. So there's two reasons why we distinguish between the two. So to answer your question about vegetarianism, in order to break this precept, you as an individual sentient being have to observe a living sentient being give rise in your own mind to the wish to take the life of that sentient being, and then take the life of that sentient being. That's the only way in which you break the vow. So hunting is definitely not permissible. Fishing is definitely not permissible. Of course, if your own life is at stake, and you're trying to, then I would say go ahead. If you are in a life or death situation, I would say, to not feel happy about what's happening, to not like do it gleefully, to not do it, with a sense of, but, to that for most people in most circumstances, the teaching is quite practical. And they would say only a highly realized practitioner should be someone who gives up their life to protect others, to protect non-humans, and to decide, I will not hunt, I will not fish, I will die. You should probably be highly advanced before making that decision. Because again, you yourself have the ability to achieve enlightenment in this life. And you shouldn't disregard that just because in order to sustain that, you might have to hunt, you might have to fish. I will also say, so I'm trying to present this in a accurate way with regard to the vows, with regard to the training precepts. It's also the case that there is a sutra, the Lankavatara Sutra, which you can look up. There's a whole chapter called On Eating Meat in the Lankavatara Sutra. It is a Mahayana sutra, so it isn't shared with the Pali canon. It's part of the Sanskrit canon. But in the Lankavatara Sutra, the Buddha gives a lot of reasons why a person would abandon the eating of meat, irrespective of who is responsible for the taking of the life of that animal. So from the Mahayana perspective, if a person takes the Lankavatara Sutra very seriously, it presents a lot of very compelling reasons for vegetarianism. That's definitely true. But only the person who slaughters the animal is, if they, of course, they have to be Buddhist, they have to have agreed to come under these training precepts. But so it is therefore important for a Buddhist to think about what they do for a living, and whether their job requires them to take life, because it's incompatible with the precept, the training precept. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, that was helpful. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? Nope. So then the second precept is do not steal. So again, these training precepts, generally, a person comes under them when they decide to formally become Buddhist. And so stealing here may have a different meaning than it could otherwise have, that it might have had for that person prior to actually formally becoming Buddhist. Because in this context, to steal is to take anything that has not been freely given, and you could say by a person who has a right to give it. So we might not think that if you see a dollar bill, blowing down the sidewalk when there's no one around, we might not think of that as stealing because it doesn't seem to belong to anyone. We're not taking it out of someone's wallet. We're not knowingly depriving anyone of their property. However, it hasn't been freely given to us by someone who has the right to do that. So it is stealing from the Buddhist perspective. We ought not just pick up something that we come across after we've come under this particular training. We need to be very mindful of, has this been freely given to me by the person who is the owner of it. And if not, then it doesn't belong to me. I should just, maybe I will put it in a safe place. If it's a lot of money, maybe we take it to a police station. If we're trying to reunite it with, its owner, we can take steps, but we ought not appropriate it for our own use. We ought not think of it as something that we can take as our own resource if it hasn't been freely given to us by the person who is the owner of the object. And that might be a new way of thinking about stealing. It might be a higher bar. But from the point that we take the vows, that is the bar that we're meant to adopt, that we're meant to think about it in that more detailed way. And again, there could be here with all of these, again, they're training precepts. So we do have to use some level of common sense with respect to what is our motivation. With all of these, really, the reason that the Buddha gave these training precepts is because what he observed is that for an ordinary sentient being, it's very difficult to give rise to the motivation or the interest in wanting to do these things without there being a strong, afflicted state in the mind. When we kill, when we steal, we're doing it out of negativity, almost always. The two things. So really, lying, or we'll get to, but killing, stealing, these other negative actions, they are stand-ins for affliction. They are signs of affliction. They are ways of recognizing affliction or delusion. And it's the affliction or delusion that is the problem. And these are proxies for that arising in the mind. Because under most circumstances, you wouldn't do if love, compassion, generosity, if those were the kinds of mental states that were strongly arising in the mind. But in some instances, here and there, you can think of times with some of these under certain circumstances where, for example, you might take someone's car keys if they've had too much to drink, and you're worried about them getting in a car and killing themselves or killing other people. Now, it's not your car. It's not your car keys. You are kind of stealing. They don't want you to take the car keys. You don't have title to the car. You're kind of, doing something that you don't necessarily really have the right to do, but you're doing it out of a very good motivation. So we shouldn't think, oh, well, the Buddha said I can't steal, so I'm going to let them take the car keys and get in the car and maybe kill themselves or kill other people. We have to be practical about this. And, there could be times when, particularly maybe with an animal that's being, violent or, and we're acting in defense of a child or defense of, someone else, and we may have to engage in an action that would otherwise, so we can't just have a slavish kind of, controlling attitude toward these precepts. We do have to come to them with our wisdom, such as it is, and try to grow our wisdom over time so that we're being realistic about how we're trying to implement and how we're trying to work with the precepts. And again, this applies to lying, for example, as well, which is the third precept, to do not lie. So when we lie, we say something that we know to be untrue. If we are mistaken, then if it isn't true, but we believe it to be true, if we ourselves are deceived, then we're not lying. We're just repeating a falsehood, but we believe it. And that's, maybe we need to try to investigate things more deeply to be responsible about our speech. But it isn't a lie unless we know that it's a lie and we're trying to deceive other people. But here again, you could imagine that if we know that one person means to do harm to another person, and they ask us if we know where the other person is, and we can anticipate that they will do that person harm if we divulge their location, probably we shouldn't divulge their location. We shouldn't honestly answer their question. We could remain silent. We could say, it's none of your business. I'm not talking to you about this. We could go about it in various ways. We don't always have to tell the truth. We don't always have to say what we know to be true if the consequences of that are going to be really problematic, if it's going to give rise to great harm. We have to be reasonable about things. In the same way too, we could think about what is skillful when a person asks us a question about how they look, or something, and is it skillful to give them a really devastating, even though that might be our opinion, you know can we present things in a more skillful way, that isn't going to cause hurt feelings. We have to be skillful, we have to be wise about how we do this, and not just say, well, the Buddha said I should always just tell the complete unvarnished truth in every single instance, irrespective of thinking about any consequence that might arise. We do have to think about the effect of our words, and think, is there a skillful way that I can respond without giving rise to some greater harm? Okay. I'm just trying to get through these before the time is over, but we just also go through the fourth and the fifth, and then I'll pause for questions. So the fourth precept is to not commit sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct is of two types. There's adultery, and then there's non-consensual sexual behavior. Adultery doesn't require a marriage. It doesn't require some kind of legal, relationship, but it does require a realistic expectation of monogamy. So if you're in an intimate relationship and there is a realistic expectation of monogamy, and you violate that, irrespective of whether there's a marriage or what have you, that is adultery. If you cause someone else knowingly to violate their reasonable expectation of monogamy in their relationship, then you yourself have committed sexual misconduct. If they deceived you about, they said that they were single, what have you, then you haven't done anything wrong. But if you knowingly cause someone else to violate a reasonable expectation of monogamy, that's adultery. And of course, non-consensual is non-consensual. Anything that the other person doesn't want, is non-consensual. So of course, both of these exist in a spectrum of behavior. To some degree, this idea of violating monogamy, that's a spectrum of, even flirtatious behavior, you could say, is somewhere on that spectrum. Maybe going to a private dinner that your significant other wouldn't be happy about is maybe somewhere on that spectrum. But then, of course, you've got increasingly more overt behaviors, physical behaviors, that, really, really break that vow. But we do want to be cognizant of this spectrum of, unwanted touching, etc. Just the whole spectrum we want to be cognizant of, and really try to avoid anything that's anywhere on that spectrum. And particularly, of course, avoiding the more overt acts, physical acts that, really very clearly would break, those, because this is something that causes a lot of pain. This is something that causes a great deal of harm to others, our significant others. These are ways in which we wound people very deeply, when we violate these reasonable expectations of monogamy, or we engage in unwanted acts. We cause great harm to those around us. So it's something really that we need to be mindful of, and to take pains to really just completely avoid as much as possible. And if they have an unreasonable expectation of monogamy, if from their side they have an infatuation or something that hasn't been discussed, isn't really valid, then of course, that's coming from their mind. But if it's been talked about, if it's been agreed to, if it's a foundation of what's understood, then we need to live up to that expectation. And then the last is to not take intoxicants. So an intoxicant, here, as it says, the definition is any substance that leads to heedlessness that doesn't serve a medicinal purpose. So we know that there are many drugs, many different things, that when we say heedlessness, we mean losing, giving rise to disinhibition, creating an internal mental state where it's difficult to be clear-eyed. It's difficult to have a clear sense of what's happening around us. And it's also difficult to clearly remember our own values, our own ethics, our own priorities, what we think is important. We know that there are many substances that can give rise to that. Even just painkillers and things that we might be prescribed. When they say don't operate heavy machinery, they're saying, your mind might become fuzzy, it might become obscured when you're under the influence of those. So, and of course, even with things like marijuana, there are valid medicinal purposes to something like that. So that what it turns on is whether or not we, as a practitioner, are genuinely of the view, the opinion, that we have a deficit, that we have an illness, that there's something wrong. And our goal is to kind of return ourselves to a relatively normal level of functioning with as few side effects as is possible, as is reasonable. Whatever we might choose under the direction of our physician to accomplish that goal is not an intoxicant. If that is the intent, and that is, then whether it is marijuana or whether, it doesn't, because, there are cancer patients that take marijuana. There's different, different things that a person might use different things for. And so if that is all that we're trying to do, is we're saying, this is something that's wrong with me, and I'm trying to just balance that out and get back to a reasonable level of functioning, then, we might choose this or we might choose that, and it's all fine from the Buddhist perspective. However, if we're giving rise to heedlessness just to kind of have fun, then that's more problematic. Then that's not something that we're encouraged to do. And again, it's this idea of heedlessness that's the problem. It's this idea that when we're under the influence of that, we can't really recollect. These are, we have a much more difficult time navigating what's happening in the world around us. We don't know how to restrain our impulses when that's occurring. So you can think of all of the tragedies that have arisen when people are under the influence of alcohol. For example, there are people who kill other people. There are people who drink and drive. There are, people who ruin their lives, the lives of other people. So it isn't that the Buddha has a problem with people kind of relaxing, but when we can't properly gauge how to be in relationship with other people because of our mind being obscured, we're going to be in a situation where, anger can arise much more easily. We might act impulsively, we might act in ways that and we all know from our own direct experience that we've regretted, actions that we engaged in under the influence of various things, even if they weren't crimes, we didn't maybe destroy, but we regret. We wake up the next day having regretted things that we've said, things that we've done. And that's the point, is that heedlessness gives rise to actions that are not in line with our higher spiritual ideals. And of course also, and then we worry like, what did I say? What did I do? Who's going to be mad at me? Who was offended by, and we just want to kind of get rid of that. We want to live our lives free from those worries, those concerns of, did I say something I don't remember? Did I do something that was unskillful? We want to have a very mindful, sharp mind all of the time that always is navigating our relationships skillfully. So the question then for people kind of can turn on, well, is a single drink, is that really a problem? And that's something that we have to judge individually. Like, if a person has trouble stopping, then yeah, maybe a single drink is a problem if that person knows that. But if a person doesn't, and it's just like, a champagne toast or something, then maybe, there's no reason to stress about it overly, and think, well, I can't have a champagne toast at a wedding because, it's this idea of heedlessness, this idea of losing our mindfulness. That's what is really being highlighted here. So we kind of have to think about, how strictly we want to take that on board. The strictest way is to just completely avoid entirely. That's, if you do that, you don't have to worry about it. But is it true that one drink here and there is okay? That's something we have to think about. Certainly, though, the Buddha is saying, if we drink to the point of intoxication, we're going to give rise to heedlessness. And then who knows? Who knows what kinds of mistaken actions are going to flow from that? And best to just not put ourselves in that situation. It's also the case that a person who goes for refuge, they may decide that, that they can take the other four vows, and maybe they're not taking this vow. Who knows? You don't always have to take all five. Um, it's but as I said, the goal, the intent is this is the foundation that the Buddha is giving us for moving in a really positive, useful direction. So it isn't moralistic. He's highlighting these are really supportive, beneficial things that can help a person cultivate the kind of spiritual growth and development that they are seeking. And acting contrary to these might hold us back in some ways, might make that goal not ripen as quickly, as easily. But those are the 5 lay precepts. And by lay, I mean not a monastic, not a monk or a nun. The monks and nuns have a different set of precepts that can be taken after, they have held the lay vows for a while. There's a larger set of monastic vows. Any thoughts or questions or concerns about the lay precepts? Or anything else that we've covered today that a question has arisen in relation to?
I have a
Mhm.
question about intoxicants. Could that be considered any kind of like addiction? Is it basically anything that can lead to addiction? Could an intoxicant could be like work or sex or any of those things, or is it specifically just to substances that you can consume?
Yeah, it's really I mean, there's a deeper, because this isn't the sum total of everything that, these five lay precepts. They're not everything that the Buddha says about what we need to be concerned about or thinking about or is relevant or useful or important. These are five things that are kind of coarser or less difficult, because we're meant to be able to say that these are five things I'll never do again. Like, we're still going to break them, obviously, we're not actually going to uphold them perfectly forever, but they're meant to be five things that we can agree to at the time that we take the refuge vows, and then for the rest of our lives be bound by them. The subtler, so in that, because of that, they're not the subtlest kinds of problematic things. Um, so there are other things that are still relevant and important, but you know, because for example, we shouldn't scream at other people. We shouldn't berate other people. Like, that's the Buddha's going to say that. The Buddha's going to say, like, don't say horrible things to people out of anger. But that's not a vow. It's not one of the five lay vows, because it's too subtle to say, well, I'm never going to raise my voice in anger to any other sentient being. So kind of what you're bringing up in a way is the idea of attachment, the things that seem beneficial, that we can get caught up in, that we can become addicted to, that can become these habit patterns. And the Buddha has a lot to say about that. But here he's really just talking about substances that we ingest that actually have a psychoactive effect on the mind. And when that psychoactive effect is occurring, we lose sight of what we care about, how to restrain our actions, how we become disinhibited. We might say or do things that are not in our nature, or that we would normally be able to restrain ourselves from. That's really what is an intoxicant. But and so again, it's certainly true that a person can start out with like a health problem. Happens all the time. People break, they break their back and they get prescribed something, and so it serves a medicinal purpose because they're in great pain, and then they can become addicted to it, like you're saying. But then once they become addicted to it, if it is a substance that has a psychoactive effect, as soon as they're not taking it to ameliorate an actual illness, now it's an intoxicant. Now it's not serving a medicinal purpose because they're taking the oxy or whatever just to get high. So that's what it turns on whether it is validly serving a medicinal purpose. So addiction can play a role, even if it's something that is an actual medicine. Uh, okay, any other thoughts or questions? All right, so we will leave it there for today, and we will pick it back up next week and carry on.
Thank you so much for your time. That was wonderful.